The morning sun had barely risen when Dr. Maya Richardson checked her watch for the third time. It was 7:15 a.m., and she needed to be at the forensics lab by 8 o'clock a.m. sharp. A critical piece of evidence in the Thompson murder case required her immediate attention. She adjusted her navy blazer and smoothed down her curly hair, which she had neatly pulled back into a professional bun. The streets of downtown Memphis were quieter than usual this Wednesday morning. Maya drove her well-maintained but modest Honda Civic carefully through the familiar routes she had taken for the past 5 years. Her morning routine was precise. Coffee in her travel mug, briefcase loaded with case files, and her lab coat hanging in the back seat. Everything was organized, just the way she liked it. As she turned onto Maple Street, red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Maya's heart sank. She had never been pulled over before, and today of all days, she couldn't afford any delays. Following protocol, she signaled and pulled over to the right, positioning her car safely near the curb. Maya took a deep breath and placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her years ago. Through her mirror, she watched a white officer approach, his hand resting casually on his belt. Officer James Miller, as his nameplate would later show, was in his mid-40s with a stern expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. "License and registration," he said flatly, not bothering with the greeting. Maya responded with a polite, "Yes, sir," and slowly reached for her glove compartment after informing him of her movements. The morning air was crisp, and she could see her breath as she spoke. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Miller asked, studying her documents with what seemed like extra scrutiny. "No, sir, I don't," Maya replied truthfully. She had been extra careful with her driving, knowing she couldn't be late for work. "You rolled through the stop sign back there," he stated, though Maya was certain she had made a complete stop. She had even counted the usual 1-2 in her head, just as she always did. "Sir, I'm quite sure I came to a complete stop. I always do, especially at that intersection," Maya explained calmly, maintaining her professional demeanor despite feeling her frustration rise. "I'm actually on my way to work at the city forensics lab. We have an urgent case this morning." Officer Miller's expression shifted slightly, a look of skepticism crossing his face. He glanced at her car, then at her professional attire, but his doubt was evident. "The forensics lab," he repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "Yes, sir, I'm a forensic scientist. I can show you my ID badge if you'd like," Maya offered, keeping her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. She had experienced this kind of skepticism before, the subtle questioning of her credentials, the disbelief that she could hold such a position. "That won't be necessary," Officer Miller replied curtly. "I saw what I saw. You rolled through that stop sign, and that's a violation of Traffic Code 375A. He began writing the ticket, seemingly having made up his mind before their conversation even began. Maya glanced at her watch again, 7:30 a.m. now. The Thompson case evidence needed to be processed before the court hearing at 2 p.m. Every minute lost here was precious time wasted. She thought about mentioning the urgency of her work again but decided against it, recognizing that further explanation would likely fall on deaf ears. Officer Miller returned with the ticket, his expression unchanged. "You can either pay the fine of $175 or contest it in traffic court next Tuesday at 9 a.m. He tore the ticket from his book and handed it to her. "Have a nice day," he added, though his tone suggested he cared little about how her day would go. As Maya watched him walk back to his patrol car, she felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. It wasn't just about the ticket, it was about the assumptions, the quick judgments, the need to constantly prove herself in every interaction. She placed the ticket carefully in her briefcase, knowing she would contest it. Not just for the money, but for the principle. Starting her car again, Maya checked her watch one final time, 7:45 a.m. She would barely make it to the lab on time, but she was determined not to let this morning's incident affect her work. The Thompson case needed her full attention, and she'd had learned long ago to compartmentalize these challenges. After all, she hadn't earned her FET and built her career by letting other people's prejudices hold her back. With a determined set to her jaw, Maya pulled back onto the street, already mentally preparing for the day ahead. She had evidence to process, a case to build, and justice to serve. regardless of what anyone thought when they first saw her. The following Tuesday morning, Maya sat quietly in traffic court room 304, watching as case after case moved through the system like items on a conveyor belt. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable, but her posture remained perfect. She had chosen to wear her charcoal gray suit today, professional, conservative, and what she'd often called her armor for challenging situations. Judge William Barrett's reputation preceded him in the Memphis legal community. At 62 years old, with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with an air of someone who had seen it all and wasn't easily impressed. The morning's proceedings had shown his style: quick decisions, little patience for excuses, and a clear preference for efficiency over lengthy explanations. Maya observed how different defendants were treated. A well-dressed white businessman received a reduced fine for speeding. His explanation about a business emergency met with understanding nods. A young Hispanic mother, struggling with English, was quickly assigned a fine with barely a chance to explain her situation. Maya took mental notes, her scientific mind automatically cataloging patterns and variables. Case number 47,823, Richardson versus State of Tennessee, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Maya stood, smoothing her suit jacket as she walked to the podium. She felt the weight of eyes on her: the bailiff, the clerk, other waiting defendants, and most importantly, Judge Barrett himself. Ms. Richardson, Judge Barrett began, glancing at the paperwork before him with casual disinterest. You're contesting a ticket for running a stop sign. Do you have any evidence to support your claim of innocence? His tone suggested he had already made up his mind. Yes, Your Honor, Maya began, her voice clear and measured. I am Dr. Maya Richardson, and I can assure you that I made a complete stop that morning. I follow the same route to work every day, and I'm particularly careful at that intersection due to its proximity to a school zone. Judge Barrett looked up from his papers, his eyebrows lifting slightly at her title, but his expression remained skeptical. Doctor, he interrupted, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. And what kind of doctor would that be? I hold a PhD in forensic science, Your Honor, and I work as a senior forensic scientist at the Memphis Crime Laboratory, Maya replied, maintaining her composure despite the familiar sting of having her credentials questioned. A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Barrett leaned forward, removing his glasses and fixing Maya with a stern look. Dr. Richardson, your educational background, impressive as it may be, doesn't change the fact that Officer Miller, a veteran of 15 years, observed you violating traffic laws. Maya took a deep breath before responding. Your Honor, I understand and respect Officer Miller's experience. However, I maintain that I made a complete stop. I was on my way to process crucial evidence for a murder case, and I was being especially careful not to violate any traffic laws because I couldn't afford any delays that morning. Ah, Judge Barrett said, his tone turning slightly condescending. So you were in a hurry to get to this lab of yours? The pause before lab was subtle but unmistakable. The courtroom had grown quieter now, with even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations falling silent. Maya could feel her heart racing, but her voice remained steady. No, Your Honor. Being in a hurry is precisely why I was being extra cautious. My work requires attention to detail and strict adherence to protocols. These habits extend to every aspect of my life, including my driving. Judge Barrett shuffled some papers on his bench, barely concealing his impatience. Dr. Richardson, this court sees dozens of contested traffic violations every day. Everyone has a story, everyone has somewhere important to be, and everyone claims they didn't commit the violation. Do you have any actual evidence besides your word against Officer Miller's? Maya stood her ground, her spine straight as a ruler. Your Honor, I understand the burden of proof lies with me. However, I would respectfully point out that my professional reputation and integrity are built on precision and truthfulness. I wouldn't risk that by lying about a traffic violation. The judge's expression hardened. Fine. $175 plus $50 court costs. Next case. His gavel came down with a sharp crack, cutting off any further discussion. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware they had just witnessed something more than a simple traffic case. As Maya gathered her belongings, she noticed the young court clerk giving her an apologetic look. But Maya's expression remained neutral, professional. She had expected this outcome, but principles mattered. Little did Judge Barrett know, their paths would cross again very soon, under very different circumstances. The fluorescent lights of the court clerk's office buzzed overhead as Maya stood in line to pay her fine. Her shoulders were tense, but her face remained composed as she waited behind 3 other people. The morning's interaction with Judge Barrett kept replaying in her mind, each replay bringing fresh waves of frustration. Sarah Martinez, the young court clerk who had witnessed the earlier proceedings, was working the payment window. She had been watching Maya since she entered the line, occasionally glancing up from her computer screen with sympathetic eyes. When it was finally Maya's turn, Sarah's voice was notably gentler than it had been with the previous people in line. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah said, emphasizing the title that Judge Barrett had so carelessly dismissed, "I'll help you process your payment." She began typing into her computer, her fingers hesitating slightly before continuing. "It's $225 total." Maya reached into her briefcase for her wallet, her movements deliberate and controlled. As she pulled out her credit card, she noticed her hands were steady. Years of precise lab work had taught her to control even the smallest tremors of emotion. The sound of quiet murmuring drew her attention to a small group of court employees near the water cooler, their eyes darting away when she looked in their direction. "I've worked here for 3 years," Sarah said quietly as she processed the payment, "and I've never seen Judge Barrett quite so." She paused, searching for a diplomatic word. "Dismissive without cause." Her eyes met Maya's briefly before looking down at the receipt printer. Maya appreciated the young clerk's attempt at solidarity, but she had experienced enough similar situations to know that dwelling on it wouldn't help. "It's not an uncommon response," she replied softly, her voice carrying no bitterness, just stated fact. Just then, the heavy wooden door to the clerk's office swung open, and Judge Barrett strode in, his black robe swishing as he walked. The room fell silent. He was heading toward the filing cabinet near the payment window, apparently needing some document for his next case. His eyes briefly met Maya's, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite recognition, not quite doubt, but something that made him pause mid-stride. Maya took her receipt from Sarah, folded it carefully, and placed it in her wallet. She could feel Judge Barrett's presence behind her, could sense him watching as she organized her belongings with the same precision she used in her lab. The silence in the room had grown thick, uncomfortable. As she turned to leave, Maya's lab phone buzzed in her pocket. She answered it professionally, her voice clear and authoritative. "Dr. Richardson speaking." The voice on the other end was urgent, speaking rapidly about the Thompson murder case. "Yes, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything until I arrive. The trace evidence needs to be documented exactly as found." Judge Barrett was still standing near the filing cabinet, pretending to shuffle through papers but clearly listening. Maya could see his reflection in the window, could see how his hands had stopped moving through the files as he heard her phone conversation. "Thank you for your help," Maya said to Sarah, her voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly across the quiet room. "I need to get back to the lab now. We have a time-sensitive murder case that requires my expertise." As she walked toward the door, her heels clicking purposefully on the tile floor, Maya held her head high. She didn't look back at Judge Barrett, didn't need to see if her words had any effect. The weight of the fine didn't matter. She had faced bigger obstacles in her journey to become one of the city's top forensic scientists. Outside the clerk's office, Maya paused to check her watch. She had exactly 17 minutes to get back to the lab, change into her white coat, and begin processing the new evidence. The morning's events would be filed away in her mind, categorized with all the other instances of prejudgment she'd encountered in her career. What Maya didn't see as she walked away was Judge Barrett moving to the window, watching her get into her car. She didn't see him pick up her case file again, studying it more carefully this time, and she didn't see Sarah the clerk shaking her head slightly as she organized the morning's paperwork, knowing that somehow this wasn't the end of the story. 2 hours later, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers, preparing for the high-profile Thompson murder case. The morning's traffic court sessions had left him tired, but this case demanded his full attention. The media had been covering it extensively, a wealthy businessman found dead in his home, with evidence suggesting corporate espionage gone wrong. "Your Honor," his assistant Michael knocked and entered, looking somewhat anxious. "The district attorney wanted me to inform you that our key expert witness is running about 10 minutes late. She's finishing up some crucial lab work related to the case." Barrett frowned, checking his gold watch. "We're already behind schedule. Who is this expert witness that thinks they can delay my courtroom?" His voice carried the same authoritative tone he had used all morning in traffic court. "Dr. Richardson from the forensics labs, sir. She's the lead scientist on the case," Michael replied, shuffling through his papers. "She's apparently found some breakthrough evidence that could change everything." The name tickled something in Barrett's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He had heard hundreds of names today alone. "Well, I suppose we can't proceed without key evidence. Tell the DA we'll start 15 minutes late, but I want everyone else ready to go." The main courtroom was a far cry from the traffic court. Rich wooden panels lined the walls, and the afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, creating dramatic shadows. News reporters sat in the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. The Thompson family's expensive lawyers were arranging their documents, while the DA's team waited patiently. At precisely 2:15 p.m., the courtroom doors opened. Judge Barrett, who had been reviewing his notes, looked up to see who had entered. His hand froze mid-page turn. Walking confidently toward the witness stand was a familiar face, the same woman he had found just hours ago. But Dr. Maya Richardson looked different now. She wore a pristine white lab coat over her professional attire, her ID badge prominently displayed. She carried a thick folder of documents and a sealed evidence bag. The color drained from Judge Barrett's face as realization dawned. The lab she had mentioned wasn't some entry-level position or small medical office as he had assumed. She was Dr. Richardson, the one whose forensic work had been crucial in solving some of the city's most challenging cases. "Please state your name and credentials for the court," the DA requested once Maya was sworn in. "Dr. Maya Richardson, PhD in forensic science from Johns Hopkins University. I'm the senior forensic scientist at the Memphis Criminal Investigation Laboratory, where I've worked for the past 5 years. I've testified as an expert witness in over 50 criminal cases and published 12 peer-reviewed papers in leading forensic journals." Judge Barrett's discomfort grew with each qualification she listed. He remembered his dismissive tone from earlier, his casual dismissal of her profession. Now, watching her arrange her evidence with meticulous care, he saw what he should have seen before: her precision, her professionalism, her expertise. The court recorder's fingers flew across her keyboard as Maya began explaining her findings. She spoke with authority and clarity, breaking down complex scientific concepts into terms the jury could understand. Her analysis of trace evidence found at the crime scene was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely crucial to the case. Throughout her testimony, Maya maintained absolute professionalism. She never once glanced at Judge Barrett with resentment or triumph, though she must have been aware of his discomfort. Instead, she focused entirely on her duty to the court and to justice. The journalists in the back scribbled furiously as Maya presented her evidence. One of them whispered to another, "That's the Richardson test she's talking about. She developed it herself. It's become standard procedure in forensic labs across the country." Judge Barrett found himself having to concentrate hard to maintain his judicial composure. Each time Maya referenced her years of experience or explained another groundbreaking technique she had helped develop, he felt the weight of his earlier prejudice more heavily. As Maya's testimony concluded, Barrett noticed something else: the respect she commanded from everyone in the courtroom. Lawyers on both sides treated her with deference. The jury was captivated by her expertise. Even his own court staff viewed her with obvious admiration. The same woman he had dismissed hours ago was now proving herself to be not just a scientist, but one of the most respected experts in her field. And Judge William Barrett, known for his unwavering demeanor, found himself struggling with a very unfamiliar feeling: shame. The afternoon sun cast long shadows in the courtroom as Dr. Maya Richardson continued her expert testimony. She stood beside a large display board showing microscopic fiber evidence, her laser pointer moving with precise, confident gestures. The Thompson murder case had taken an unexpected turn thanks to her findings. "Your Honor," Maya addressed Judge Barrett directly, her voice clear and professional, "what we discovered in the victim's office changes everything about this case." She held up a sealed evidence bag containing what looked like tiny blue threads. These synthetic fibers found on Mr. Thompson's desk have a unique chemical signature. They come from a type of carpet manufactured exclusively for foreign embassies. Judge Barrett found himself leaning forward, genuinely intrigued despite his lingering discomfort. The same voice he had dismissed hours ago in traffic court now commanded the attention of everyone present. He watched as Maya moved to the computer setup, bringing up detailed chemical analysis charts on the courtroom's large screen. Using a technique I developed during my postdoctoral research, Maya continued, we were able to match these fibers to a specific manufacturing batch. Only 3 embassies in the city received carpeting from this batch. She clicked through several microscope images, explaining each one with expert precision. The defense attorney, a man known for his aggressive cross-examinations, stood up. Dr. Richardson, are you suggesting that someone from a foreign embassy was involved in Mr. Thompson's death? Maya's response was measured and confident. The evidence suggests that whoever killed Mr. Thompson had recently been in one of these embassies. Combined with the trace elements we found under the victim's fingernails, we can narrow it down to a specific location. Judge Barrett found himself increasingly impressed by her composure. When the defense attorney tried to challenge her methodology, Maya calmly pulled up peer-reviewed articles she had published in scientific journals. When he questioned her experience, she listed the high-profile cases she had helped solve. Each response was delivered with the same professional dignity she had shown in his traffic court, dignity he had failed to recognize. Your Honor, the defense attorney said, turning to Barrett, I'd like to question Dr. Richardson's qualifications to make these assertions. Before Judge Barrett could respond, the district attorney stood up. Your Honor, Dr. Richardson's credentials are beyond reproach. She quite literally wrote the book on modern forensic fiber analysis. Her methods are used by the FBI and international law enforcement agencies. Judge Barrett cleared his throat. I've reviewed Dr. Richardson's credentials thoroughly, he said, the irony of his mourning behavior not lost on him. Her qualifications are not in question. Please proceed with relevant questions about the evidence. Maya continued her presentation, explaining how the fiber evidence connected to financial documents found on the victim's computer. She had worked with the FBI's cybercrime unit to decode encrypted files, revealing a complex international espionage scheme. Her testimony wove together physical evidence, chemical analysis, and digital forensics into an airtight case. The jurors were completely engaged, taking detailed notes. Even the usually restless journalists in the back of the courtroom sat in rapt attention. Judge Barrett noticed how Maya adjusted her explanations when discussing technical details, making complex scientific concepts accessible without oversimplifying them. Finally, Maya said, reaching the conclusion of her testimony, the DNA analysis we completed this morning confirms our findings. She glanced at her watch, the same watch she had checked anxiously in traffic court. The full report has been submitted to the court, along with the chain of custody documentation and peer review confirmations. As Maya stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Barrett realized she had just delivered one of the most professional and comprehensive expert testimonies he had ever heard in his courtroom. The morning's traffic court incident now felt even more shameful in contrast to the brilliant scientist he had witnessed. The remainder of the afternoon's proceedings seemed to move in slow motion for Judge Barrett. He found his mind returning to how quickly he had judged Maya based on his own preconceptions. Here was a woman who had revolutionized aspects of forensic science, whose work helped solve crimes across the country, and he had treated her with less respect than he'd shown to a teenager contesting a parking ticket. As he called for the day's recess, Judge Barrett watched Maya gathering her presentation materials. She moved with the same careful precision she had shown when handling evidence, her professionalism unwavering. He realized that while he had spent the afternoon seeing her in a new light, she had been this person all along. He had just been too blind to see it. After the court session ended, Judge William Barrett sat alone in his chambers, his dinner getting cold on the desk before him. The wall clock showed 7:30 p.m., but he couldn't bring himself to leave yet. On his computer screen, the traffic court footage from that morning played on repeat, each viewing making him more uncomfortable than the last. Do you have any actual evidence besides your word against Officer Miller's? His own voice, dripping with condescension, filled his ears. Barrett paused the video, studying his expression as he had dismissed Dr. Richardson's explanation. How different he looked then, so certain of his authority, so quick to judge. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, quickly closing the video window. Sarah Martinez, the court clerk from that morning, entered with a stack of files. "Sir, I brought Dr. Richardson's complete court history, as you requested," Sarah said, placing the folders on his desk. She served as an expert witness in 57 cases over the past 5 years. Her testimony has helped solve 12 cold cases. Barrett nodded, picking up the top folder. "Thank you, Sarah. And the traffic court records?" "Yes, sir." Sarah pulled out a separate document. "I checked the records for that intersection where Dr. Richardson was ticketed. There have been 17 similar citations in the past month, but," she hesitated before continuing, "dashcam footage was only requested for 3 of those stops. All 3 drivers were people of color." The judge's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses. The statistics painted a picture he had been too blind to see. He thought about his own daughter, a second-year medical student, and how he would feel if someone dismissed her credentials and expertise the way he had dismissed Dr. Richardson's. "Sir," Sarah spoke again, her voice gentle but firm, "there's something else you should know. Dr. Richardson volunteers at the city's youth science program. She mentors young girls, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds, encouraging them to pursue careers in science. She was actually heading to the lab early that morning to finish work so she could attend a mentoring session in the afternoon." Barrett looked up sharply. "She still made it to the session?" "Yes, sir, right after her court appearance. She didn't want to disappoint the girls." Sarah straightened some papers on his desk, adding quietly, "One of those girls is my niece. She wants to be a scientist because of Dr. Richardson." The weight of his morning's behavior pressed down on Barrett's shoulders even harder. He opened Dr. Richardson's file, finding newspaper clippings about her achievements. One headline read, "Local forensic scientist revolutionizes DNA analysis." Another showed her receiving an award from the governor for her contributions to law enforcement. Barrett pushed back from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. In 30 years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. Yet today's events forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His assumptions and biases had clouded his judgment. He thought about all the other cases that had passed through his courtroom. How many times had he made similar snap judgments? How many times had he failed to see past his own preconceptions? Returning to his desk, Barrett picked up a pen and began writing notes. His judicial demeanor had always been stern, focused on efficiency over empathy. But efficiency without fairness wasn't justice at all. The irony wasn't lost on him. It took a scientist to make him see the flaws in his own system. "Sarah," he called out as the clerk turned to leave, "please clear my morning schedule tomorrow. I need to make some changes to how we handle traffic court cases." After Sarah left, Barrett replayed the morning's video one more time. He watched himself dismiss a highly qualified professional simply because she didn't fit his preconceived image of what a forensic scientist should look like. The shame of it burned, but he knew shame alone wasn't enough. Real change would require action. Taking out a legal pad, he began drafting a new set of guidelines for his courtroom. Equal time for all defendants, standardized questioning procedures, regular review of citation patterns. It was a start, but he knew the real work would be addressing his own biases, the ones he hadn't even realized he carried until Dr. Richardson's case forced him to see them. 3 days after the Thompson case testimony, Dr. Maya Richardson sat in her office at the forensics lab, reviewing test results from her latest case. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the various awards and certificates that lined her walls. Her phone buzzed with a message from the court administrator, requesting her presence for a meeting with Judge Barrett. Maya checked her watch, 10 o'clock a.m. She had been expecting this meeting, though she hadn't known when it would come. With careful movements, she saved her work, straightened her desk, and gathered her thoughts. The walk to the courthouse took exactly 12 minutes, just as it always did. Judge Barrett's chambers looked different in the morning light. Gone was the stern authority figure from traffic court, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in just a few days. He stood as Maya entered, his usual judicial robe absent, wearing instead a simple gray suit. "Dr. Richardson," he began, his voice carrying none of its previous condescension, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." He gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk, not the hard wooden one typically reserved for visitors. Maya sat down, her posture professional but relaxed. She noticed the files spread across his desk, her cases, her publications, her contributions to forensic science. He had clearly done his homework this time. Before I say anything else, Barrett continued, clearing his throat, I owe you a profound apology. My behavior in traffic court was inexcusable. I let my preconceptions and biases affect my judgment, and in doing so, I failed not only you but the principles of justice I'm sworn to uphold. Maya listened carefully, her face showing neither triumph nor resentment. She had experienced enough apologies in her career to know which ones were genuine. This one carried the weight of real understanding. Your Honor, she began, but Barrett raised his hand gently. Please, in this conversation, I'm just William Barrett, a person who made a serious mistake and is trying to make it right. He pulled out a document from his desk. I've already vacated your traffic fine, though I know this isn't about the money. Maya nodded, then spoke with the same clear, professional tone she used in court. Mr. Barrett, I appreciate your apology, but you should know that what happened in your courtroom wasn't unique. It was just another Tuesday for me and countless others like me. Barrett's face showed genuine pain at her words. Would you be willing to share some of those experiences? Not for my comfort, but because I need to understand the full scope of what I've been part of. For the next hour, Maya spoke about her journey. She told him about the security guards who regularly stopped her at the courthouse, despite her wearing her ID badge. She described the police officers who questioned her presence at crime scenes, even as she worked to collect crucial evidence. She shared stories of being mistaken for support staff during scientific conferences where she was the keynote speaker. The hardest part, she explained, watching Barrett take notes, isn't the big moments of obvious prejudice. It's the constant small assumptions, the tiny dismissals, the daily need to prove and reprove your competence. Barrett set down his pen, his face showing deep reflection. I've spent the past few days reviewing hundreds of cases from my court. The patterns are clear, and they're shameful. But I'm not sharing this to show you I've learned my lesson. I'm sharing it because I need your help. Maya raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I'm implementing new procedures in my courtroom, but procedures alone aren't enough. Would you consider being part of a committee to review and reform our court's approach to justice? Your scientific background, combined with your personal experience, would be invaluable. Maya considered the offer carefully. She thought about the young girls she mentored, about Sarah's niece who dreamed of being a scientist. Change had to start somewhere. I'll do it, she said finally, on one condition. This can't be about making you feel better about what happened. It has to create real, measurable change. Barrett nodded solemnly. I wouldn't expect anything less from a scientist of your caliber, Dr. Richardson. The metrics and accountability will be built into every step of the process. As Maya stood to leave, Barrett asked one final question. Do you think real change is possible in a system with such deep-rooted problems? Maya paused at the door, her answer coming from both the scientist and the person she was. In my work, Mr. Barrett, even the smallest trace of evidence can crack open a case. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to look at the evidence and admit they were wrong. 6 months later, the Memphis County Courthouse looked different. New signs clearly displayed defendants' rights in multiple languages. Security guards wore body cameras. Most importantly, the atmosphere had changed. Judge William Barrett's courtroom had become a model for judicial reform across the state. On this particular morning, Dr. Maya Richardson stood before a packed auditorium in the courthouse's main conference room. The audience included judges, lawyers, police officers, and court staff from across the state. Her presentation slide showed clear statistics. Traffic stop disparities had decreased by 40% since the new guidelines were implemented. The data speaks for itself, Maya explained, using the same clear, professional tone she used in her forensic testimony. When we implemented standardized questioning procedures and required regular reviews of citation patterns, we saw immediate changes in outcome disparities. In the front row, Judge Barrett nodded, taking notes just as he had done that day in his chambers. He had kept his promise. Every change was measured, documented, and analyzed with scientific rigor. Maya's expertise had transformed not just their approach to reform, but how they measured its success. Sarah Martinez, now promoted to chief court clerk, stood up during the question period. Can you tell us about the mentorship program? She asked, smiling as she thought about her niece, who was now interning at Maya's lab. The Youth Justice and Science program has already reached 300 students, Maya replied, changing slides to show young faces engaged in scientific activities. We're teaching them about both forensic science and justice system operations. Many of our participants are now considering careers in law enforcement, legal services, or scientific fields. The program had been Maya's idea, connecting her passion for science education with the court's reform efforts. Judge Barrett had supported it fully, even volunteering to teach sessions about legal principles. The sight of the stern judge explaining constitutional rights to excited teenagers had become a regular occurrence at the courthouse. After the presentation, Maya walked through the courthouse hallways, noticing the changes. Officers who had once viewed her with suspicion now greeted her with respect. The security guard who had frequently questioned her ID badge was currently explaining the new security protocols to a group of visitors, emphasizing respect and consistency. In her office at the lab later that afternoon, Maya reviewed a letter from the state Supreme Court. They wanted to implement her reforms statewide. As she read, a news alert popped up on her computer. The Thompson case, which had started all of this, had reached its final appeal. Her testimony had held up under every scrutiny, helping secure justice. Judge Barrett appeared at her office door, knocking gently despite it being open. "Dr. Richardson, do you have a moment?" He held a thick folder of documents. "The governor's office called. They want us to present our program at the National Justice Reform Conference next month." Maya smiled, remembering their first encounters. The man who had once dismissed her credentials now regularly sought her expertise. Their weekly reform committee meetings had evolved into a genuine partnership for change. "There's something else," Barrett added, pulling out a court document. "Remember Officer Miller, who issued your ticket that day? He just completed our new training program. He personally requested to be part of the community outreach team." Maya took the document, reading it carefully, a habit she never lost whether handling evidence or paperwork. The officer's statement showed genuine understanding of how unconscious bias had affected his work. Sometimes, change came from unexpected places. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through her office window, Maya thought about all that had happened since that morning in traffic court. One incident had sparked a chain reaction, leading to real, measurable changes in their justice system. Her scientific approach to analyzing bias had provided the evidence needed to convince even the most skeptical officials. "You know," Barrett said, looking at the wall of thank you letters from students in their program, "that day in traffic court was the most important mistake of my career. It taught me that justice isn't just about following laws. It's about seeing people, really seeing them." Maya nodded, thinking of all the young scientists and future legal professionals they were now mentoring. "In science," she replied, "we say that the most important discoveries often come from unexpected observations. The key is being willing to learn from them." As they discussed the upcoming conference, Maya's phone buzzed with messages from her mentees, sharing their latest achievements. The change hadn't just been in policies and procedures. It was in the people, one interaction at a time. What had started as a moment of injustice had grown into a movement for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful evidence wasn't found in a lab, but in the human capacity to learn and grow.